I just want to talk about a trial. And it surprisingly is not Sabine's trial, which took place in late 2018, but a trial which took place a couple of years earlier. And it had a profound effect on the entire Hampstead case, even though it ended in complete disaster. The charges arise from the demonstrations which took place outside the church in Hampstead. Now, some of you might recall, you saw maybe the videos or whatever, and you might remember that there was an American woman, Christine Ann Sands, standing outside the church and screaming obscenities at some of the churchgoers, like they're effing babies and so forth, and also screaming like, HampsteadChristChurch.com. And there were also other protesters on that same day who went inside the church and were witnessed by several people creating disturbances. And it really was a scary time for a lot of people. One of the children actually believed that the protesters were going to try to burn the church down with the people inside and was sobbing hysterically. Others were just looking around, not sure what to do. It was a very scary time. The people outside were, as you know, very, very upset because of Mrs. Justice Poffley's recent judgment in which she decided that the whole thing had been a hoax, which we now pretty much conclude is the truth. The charges came when both Christine Ann Sands and Neelu Berry, who we've talked about a lot on the blog, and we'll get to, probably she'll get a little video of her own at some point. She was one of the people inside the church, and also Christine Ann Sands was one outside. They were both arrested later, about, I think it was a few weeks later, actually at a Julian Assange demonstration, if I remember correctly, and both were charged with a really kind of obscure little charge called vexing a priest. I didn't even know such a thing existed. It seemed like a strange thing, but that was the charge. There it was. So Christine actually went to trial, I think a few weeks afterwards, was convicted, found guilty, and she was sent back to the United States. And there was much rejoicing, because honestly, she's an obnoxious person. But anyway, Neelu, who is no less obnoxious in her own special way, was also put on trial, but she went to trial in September of 2015. It took a while for them to get things organized for her. And one of the things that had happened when she was charged was that the police gave her copies of the witness statements. Now, that's all well and good. Everyone deserves to know what the witnesses have to say against them, and fine. But instead of looking at the statements and going like, oh, gee, they're saying this, that, and the other thing about me, I should, counter it with such and such another thing, Neelu approached Sabine McNeill, and she asked Sabine to put the witness statements up on her Whistleblower Kids blog so that people could read them and find out who was saying what about them and so forth. That's actually illegal. You're not allowed to do that. And one of the things about the witness statements is that they always contain the names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, personal information about the witnesses. So while it's important for a defendant to know what the witness is going to say, it's also important for the defendant to keep that information confidential, and to do otherwise is a fairly serious crime. So in January of 2016, at which point, as you might remember, Sabine had come back from Germany, and she had been charged on her return from Germany, but then NFA'd, no further action, by the police in December. In January, she gets a surprise visit from the police in the middle of the night, I believe it was, because she complained about it quite bitterly, and was charged with conspiring to commit witness intimidation. That is actually a pretty serious little charge, and it falls under the heading of attempting to pervert the course of justice. So, and then the fact that she was attempting to conspire to do this, allegedly, with Neelu Berry, meant that it was going to be a fairly big deal. The trial was set for July 2016, and it was touted, amongst the, both sides basically, as this is going to be the big one. This is going to be the trial that settles it all. We're all going to kind of, understand what was really happening, and everyone is going to be, put away in prison, or they're going to be freed forever, depending on which side you took. So that whole thing kind of grew, I guess, over the 6 months between arrest and trial. Of course, there were the normal, preliminary hearings and that sort of thing, and we followed them very avidly on the blog. I think it's fair to say that Sabine and Neelu's trial was a shit show from start to finish. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. In some ways, it was a little bit like Sabine's 2018 trial in that it had some of the same features. It had continuing problems with people committing contempt of court. It had harassment of people who wanted to attend the trial and felt unsafe doing so. And it had a court system and a courtroom that was completely unprepared for the chaos that this trial would bring. It took place in July 2016, and the judge was His Honor Judge Worsley, who always seemed to me to be a little bit befuddled by all of the fuss and nonsense going on. Who can blame him, really? I mean, it was pretty strange there. The big difference between Sabine and Neelu's trial and Sabine's 2018 trial, of course, spoiler alert, they both got acquitted. However, other things happened, and they were important, and we're going to get into that. So, Belinda, let's start with her. She was there with her entourage. This was the first time I'd ever seen her in public, and I had kind of expected someone a bit more imposing. She looked a little bit like a drowned mouse at the time, and that was surprising to me. It's really strange to see people that you've seen on videos and meet them in person. It can be a very strange and disorienting experience. With Belinda, I guess I was just surprised because she seemed to wield so much power within the hoax community, but in the court situation, she seemed to be kind of like small and inconsequential and trying to be noticed as little as possible. Other people who were there was Lee Kent, there was John Banks, Mary Rooney was there as usual. I think maybe Penny Pullen was there, I think. I can't remember that for sure. I could be wrong about that. And, of course, Jake Clark. And a guy named David F. Thavulu, who is from Cyprus and has been has done their video recordings for Neelu and Sabine a lot of the time. Not the one from Russia, the other one. There was also a guy called Swampy. Not his real name. We don't know what his real name was, but we called him Swampy because he kind of had hygiene issues and no one really wanted to sit too close to him. He was seen stealing sandwiches from the canteen of the courthouse, which surprised me. I kind of thought people would notice that a little bit more in a setting that's full of, police officers and lawyers and things, but apparently no one did. And this was despite the fact that Belinda was hauling along every single day of the trial. She would haul along these giant bags of sandwiches, pre-made sandwiches, all wrapped up nicely in plastic and everything, and dole them out to all of the followers who came in. Apparently, Swampy took his sandwich and then went upstairs and stole another one, so maybe he wasn't eating enough. And that actually prompted one of the supporters of the witnesses to hand him a £5 note, which he took with no apparent restraint. He thought that was perfectly fine. I guess it's okay to take £5 from Satanists as long as you don't associate yourself with them too much, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, it was kind of a strange thing. We called him Swampy the Sandwich Stealer, and he kind of has a fond place in our hearts. There was a battle over the seating in the courtroom. It was a smaller court than at Southwark. There were only 9 seats in the public gallery. And so on the first day, there was this big battle where, the supporters of the witnesses, and I was in that group, we all kind of stood by the door waiting for the trial to start. And as soon as the door was open, we're all in there and sitting down and grabbing seats. And that meant that there was only room for like 1 or 2 of the defendant supporters, and some of them wanted to stand, and the court guards wouldn't have anything to do with that because of fire regulations and so forth and so on. So it really became quite contentious, and there was muttering about how the Satanists are taking all the seats, and that sort of thing. It had to be negotiated by the court, if you can imagine. The 2 lawyers, the barristers representing Neelu and Sabine, argued successfully to the judge that each of their clients should have 3 seats allocated to their supporters, and then the 3 remaining seats would go to the supporters of the witnesses, even though there were 4 witnesses. Oh well. So fair was not fair, but whatever, you do what you can. So that was one thing. Another thing was that there was a lot of sort of jiggery-pokery happening out in the main corridor, where people on the other side were seen taking pictures of some of the witnesses' supporters, and had to be spoken to by the guards, and some of them had to have their cameras examined and so forth. So, they had to actually be spoken to quite sternly by the judge later on. Jake Clark made a spectacle of himself as usual, coming over to the group of witness supporters and claiming that he loved us, and he wanted us to convert to Christianity or something, even though all of us, as far as I know, were Christians. Then he started talking about the horrible things that he imagined that we did to babies and children, at which point we called the guards and he was told to leave us alone and never speak to us again. He suited me just fine. And that lasted until Sabine's trial, at which point he started again. Anyway, at the beginning of, I should say before the trial, really, the first thing that happened, right out of the blue, was this man walks into the court. I had no idea who he was, kind of a balding, late middle-aged guy, carrying a leather briefcase, and not dressed in a suit. Or was he? Maybe he was, I can't remember. But anyhow, he walks into the court and says in this giant, booming voice, "This is Edward W. Ellis, and speaking for the recording system." It's like, great. Who the hell is this? We'd never seen Edward Ellis before. Edward Ellis attempted to convince the judge that he had put in a form or something or another at the Royal Courts of Justice, and that therefore this trial had to be delayed because it was a higher jurisdiction and blah, 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 blah. And Judge Worsley looked at him very patiently, because this was the beginning of the trial, don't forget, and said, "I'm not really minded to do that." Which I thought was the most understated way of saying, "You fucking loony, get out of my court." He would use the phrase, "I'm not minded to do that," several times during this trial. It became kind of a catchphrase amongst the people who were watching. And he also kept having to reprimand the defendant's supporters about various contempt of court rules. Don't take pictures. No, not even right outside the courthouse. Don't take pictures of people as they come out of the courthouse. Don't stand in the street waiting for people to come out of the courthouse so you can take their pictures. Okay, don't stand around the back of the courthouse waiting so you can take people's pictures. It was ridiculous. And people were also told that they could not say anything online or in any public place that could in any way prejudice the trials. In other words, they had to really go through the whole, contempt of court and what constitutes that, what might be constituted as prejudicing a trial, and all of that sort of thing. They had to go through the whole thing several times, reiterated, sometimes loudly. I have to say that I did feel sorry for the judge. He seemed kind of overwhelmed by the whole thing. He seemed as though, like, I can imagine him at the end of every day's hearing, going into his chambers and, lying on the floor with a cold cloth on his head, just because it's like, how do you even deal with this? It was all so crazy. By the time of Sabine's trial, which was in 2018, so, a couple of years later, Judge Sally Cahill seemed much more on top of the whole thing, and much more inclined to take quick and decisive action against anything that would upset the demeanor of the court. And I thought I was actually happy to see that. I mean, I know she came across as draconian, and maybe she was in a way, but I think anyone who read the transcript of the previous trial and talked perhaps to the judge in charge of it would be well aware that the people who were coming to support the defendants were going to do strange things, and that the situation might have to be controlled for the protection of everyone in the court. Not just the witnesses and not just their supporters, but the entire court process has to be protected. And I don't think that was something that a lot of people got. The way our justice system is administered has to be fair and open to all. We all have to be able to feel comfortable going into a courthouse to watch a trial, to participate in a trial if we're a witness or a defendant. Anyone has to be able to feel okay doing that and not feel like their picture's going to be taken, or there's going to be commentary about them on the internet the next day, or that sort of thing. You need to know that that's going to happen, and that you're going to be protected from that. So probably one of the important things to know about this trial, the 2016 trial, was that all three barristers stated very clearly in court that they completely accepted Mrs. Justice Poffley's fact-finding judgment. That was important. I don't think that their clients were too pleased about it, but it was important because it said that they understood what was going on, that their issue was not that their clients were somehow justified in doing what they had done, but that for other reasons they should be acquitted. So fair enough, that they're entitled to representation the same as anyone else. Sometimes in trials they will do something called halftime submissions. The defense has listened to everything that the prosecution has said, and they decide, we're going to ask that this case be dismissed on the grounds of no case to answer. So they did. Sabine and Neelu's barristers both put in requests that the trial result in an acquittal. Acquittals, plural, I should say. The argument that won was that there was no evidence that the material that was posted was intended to be intimidating. In other words, they couldn't prove intent. There wasn't any evidence that they had conspired. So those really were the two linchpins of the entire case. And once those fell, the entire case fell. Neelu's lawyer actually said that if the defendants were normal people who behaved rationally, their actions might be considered intimidatory, but they weren't. So there were no grounds. I thought it was an exceptional thing for Neelu's lawyer to say that, because she's basically saying, my client is not quite right upstairs, which I believe is probably true, but interesting to hear in court. The judge ruled that there was indeed no case to answer, and this all happens, by the way, in the absence of the jury. When the halftime submissions, the jury doesn't hear those. The public, if they're in the gallery, can hear them, but you're not allowed to talk about them online. So the jury didn't know what was going on, but the judge said that when they came back on Monday, he would be instructing them to deliver a verdict of not guilty on the basis of no case to answer, but that he was minded to put in place some restraining orders. Even so, we walked out of the court that day pretty dejected. It was pretty hard to feel good about the way the case had gone. Because everyone, as I said at the beginning, everyone had gone in with very high hopes that this was going to be the thing that would shut the hoax down, make people stop sharing this horrible information that was damaging and just distressing to so many people and families. You know, none of that happened. It was very, very upsetting. So over the weekend, people there were phone calls going back and forth, and I think, you know, beers were had in pubs and tears were cried and you know, that sort of thing. However, on Monday, everyone assembled back in court again, and all of a sudden, everything changed. Now, we thought, and we were right, that the jury would be told that they were to deliver a verdict of no case to answer, and that did happen, but then all hell broke loose. There really isn't any other way to describe it. It was completely berserk. I'm just going to read to you from my report of that time. From the start of the morning's proceedings, Neelu was on her feet attempting to arrest the judge on charges of, oh, you know, the usual: treason, fraud, kidnapping, false arrest, no authority, etc. I think she thought that because the jury had been told to acquit, that gave her free license to go on one of her, like, Freeman on the Land berserko rampages. She asked the judge if he could be removed from duties, and unsurprisingly, he said no, he couldn't. There's a shocker for you. So the judge asked her to sit down and be quiet, and she just kept ranting at him. And finally, the judge said that either Neelu would have to leave the court or he would. And at this point, he called for a 5-minute recess. Now, the funny thing is, I mean, as you know, Neelu believes that if she drives a judge from the courtroom, ta-da, she's won. Surprise! He did come back after the 5-minute break, much to Neelu's disappointment. However, as we mentioned, restraining orders were being drafted against Neelu and Sabine. When the reality of this hit the public gallery, there was much muttering and loud commenting. While the jury was filing out of the room, a member of the public gallery stood up and asked the court whether the defendant's supporters would be able to speak to jury members now. And the judge said no, they couldn't, which seemed to incite the public gallery even further. So a woman whose 6 children had been taken into care stood up and began shouting that the courts had stolen her children, and this prompted Neelu to jump up again and start shouting over the judge, ranting at the court that they were all responsible for baby stealing, satanic rituals, and baby murdering. So Judge Worsley ordered her to sit down and warned her that any future outbursts would mean that she was arrested and she'd go down to the cells for contempt of court. So her solicitor, Asim Taj, who was also Ella's solicitor and was also, I believe, Sabine's solicitor at one point, that's maybe his claim to fame, got to represent 3 people from the Hampstead case. Anyway, he jumps up and shouts, "Research the Hampstead cover-up! This judge is trying to shut up my client so she doesn't expose the satanic cult pedophiles." That went over very well, I don't think. So Judge Worsley shouted at him to shut up, to which Mr. Taj responded, "No, you shut up!" It's like, is this really happening? By the way, the jury declined to leave. They asked if they could stay and watch till the end, because you don't get this kind of a show on morning television. Taj kept shouting. He's shouting about them killing babies, and added that the court was responsible for allowing cult members to rape, murder, and eat babies and children. Judge Worsley ordered him to sit down, and mention was made of contacting the Solicitor's Regulation Authority, which I believe was done. Mr. Taj stormed out of the courtroom, shouting as he left. The judge said that he wanted recordings of the day's event sent to him immediately. Gee, you think? And yeah, that's a bit of a career-limiting move. So Taj, I believe, he seems to have left the legal profession. I don't find him listed with the Solicitors Regulation Authority any longer, so I'm thinking he's probably gone by now. And given that particular performance, maybe not too surprising. In the afternoon, things got a bit quieter, and the business of writing up the restraining orders was underway. And it was quiet in part, I think, because 4 of Neelu and Sabine's supporters had been banned from the court. They were just basically told they had to get out because they'd been screaming and yelling. Neelu refused to come back to court without her solicitor, and he'd already fled the scene. As I say, he basically screamed at the judge and bolted. And so her barrister tried to convince her to come back into the court and kept saying, "No, you're not going to be arrested. You're not going to be arrested. It's okay." Neelu wasn't having any. I guess she figured, she probably realized she'd really pissed the judge off. That's my guess. But who knows? Who knows what goes on in people's heads? So Worsley said that he didn't see any use in arresting Neelu and Taj, but that he was going to put in the complaint. And more important, though, he drafted the restraining orders. And he drafted them good and tight. And that is really important. So, to my mind, having witnessed all of this and having seen what happened in the preceding week, it seems to me that it's likely that the outrageous behavior of the defendant's supporters was at least in part responsible for the tightness of the restraining order which would emerge. Because the way it came out was like this. Neelu and Sabine were each given restraining orders prohibiting them from contacting directly or indirectly, by themselves or by any person acting as their agent, or by any means whatsoever. So that kind of covers a lot of ground. Any of the witnesses who testified at the trial, or any person who to their knowledge is or has been clergy at Christ Church Hampstead, or staff, or a pupil at Christ Church Primary School. That's a lot of people. That's quite a few. So basically, past or future, it doesn't matter. If they're at the school or the church, they're out of bounds. You cannot talk about them. In addition, the orders barred Neelu and Sabine from entering an area surrounding the church and school. As well, they bar them from making public in any way, including on the internet, by any blog, or otherwise, including by republication of material already made public before the making of the orders, anything relating to any persons named in the order, so all of that list that I read above, any allegations of cannibalism, sexual child abuse, or Satanism at any time at or in relation to Christ Church or Christ Church Primary School. In other words, shut up about Hampstead. Just knock it off. You've done enough damage. Cut it out. So, and the other thing was that those orders were to remain in force indefinitely. Now, two things were argued by Sabine and Neelu's representatives. One was that Sabine's barrister said that she should not be included in the don't go within a certain distance of the school or church because she never had attended any of the rallies outside the church. The judge wasn't buying that. It's like, nope, what's good for one is good for both. The other thing is that the barristers both tried to get the time limit on the restraining orders put to 2 years, and again the judge wisely, I think, said no, they're indefinite, because he knew 2 years is nothing to these people. If it was only 2 years, they would just wait for 2 years and then start up again, or ignore it during the 2-year period. Who knew? He said that the discovery and submission to the court on the second day of the trial of a private blog from Sabine to Belinda Mackenzie and other supporters, stating that seats in the courtroom were taken up by Satanists from Scotland, and that the judge should be arrested, had once again only served to prove that she was obsessed and was absolutely at the heart of this continuing campaign despite the judgment. It's pretty astute. So, Sabine and Neelu both argued that and they have argued since then, and you'll hear Neelu say it over and over again, that it's a fake restraining order, it's a false restraining order, it's illegal restraining order. Absolutely not. Under the Protection from Harassment Act 1997, there was an amendment, I believe, from 2004, which stated that in the event of an acquittal from a trial, it was still quite permissible to prevent future harassment by putting a restraining order in place. There might not be sufficient evidence to convict someone, as there wasn't in this trial, but there's certainly sufficient evidence to be concerned for the safety of the people that the people are accused of harassing. So that was that. So sure enough, within a couple of weeks of the restraining orders being put in place, Sabine had begun to breach. And she was arrested, I believe, in late July of 2016, so 2 weeks after the trial ended. And then again in August. And then she was tried. She was put on trial in October of 2016, so, just a few months after, and actually pleaded guilty to breaching the restraining order. At that time, the judge told her that she needs to, give it up and find another hobby, basically. And that if she didn't, she was going to wind up in jail because of this. Well, sure enough, when it came time to charge her in the 2018 trial, 17 of the 21 charges on the indictment sheet actually related to breaches of restraining order. I believe 15 of those were online and 2 were in person. As the prosecuting barrister at that time said, she went analog. So these things all happened because of the restraining order. Given the fact that it came out in court that that the restraining orders played a big role, and the trial leading up to it played a big role in Sabine's charges, and they also discussed the October trial where she pleaded guilty, the jury would have, I think, been given the impression that she didn't care about the restraining orders. They meant nothing to her. They were like, whatever, I'll just do what I please. And that, I think, helped them to sort of establish in their minds a picture of someone who doesn't care what the law says. She's going to do what she wants to do. And my guess is that would not make them feel favorably disposed towards acquitting her when it came to the stalking charges either. Because when you see someone who's looking at a restraining order and then just basically trying to figure out ways around it, that's not good. That does not speak to someone who is honestly just trying to live their life. In her 2018 trial, her barrister would argue that 11 of those charges were indirect, so it was a link to another link. And the barrister argued that those could not really be counted as restraining order violations because possibly she was unaware that the links had been made. Whether or not one accepts that, and my acceptance is quite reserved of that argument, whether you accept that or not, the point is that it could not be proved to the satisfaction of the jury. Fair enough. That happens. That's cool. The other ones, however, were very, very, very overt. And it was clear she had no intention of going on with it. She was just going to continue doing this, sharing this stuff, this utter filth, until the day she died. So basically, the 2016 trial affected not only the 2018 trial, but also the 2017 trial of Rupert, which we haven't talked about yet, and I will eventually get to that. It also affected people who were still attempting to promote the idea of the hoax. So a lot of them kind of just closed up shop and haven't said much since. So, as we know, one of the exceptions to that is Angela Power Disney. But that's because she believed until quite recently that she was secure in her little nest in Ireland or Lanzarote, take your pick, and was shocked, incensed, and ultimately terrified to realize that she could be charged and that the police in Ireland would know about what happened in England in Sabine's case, and that they would know what the judgment was and what the sentence was and what the arguments were, and that in fact what she had been doing was very similar to what Sabine had been doing, and she might face the same consequences. So we don't know yet what the Director of Public Prosecutions in Ireland is going to have to say about that. Many of us have our fingers crossed, and I'm sure you can predict in which direction. But I guess that remains to be seen. However, I do think that aside from the real hardcore loonies like, Divine and Captain Woodchipper, I think it's fair to say that the restraining orders and Sabine's ultimate conviction and sentencing had a very chilling effect. Belinda hasn't said a word about the hoax since then that I'm aware of. Everyone seems to have just gone like, phew, it's just, okay, the air just went out of this thing. That's, I think, how a trial that ended in disaster turned out to be actually one of the most valuable stepping stones along the way to finally putting this thing to bed. If you've made it this far, maybe you'd like to hit the subscribe button and make sure that you don't miss other videos from the Hoaxtead Research YouTube channel. So with that, I will bid you adieu and take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.